All right, so let's start with intro to the human body. All right, so start with some directional terms that you need to be familiar with. So if you look at the arm, being closer to the base of the body, we call that proximal, closer to the fingers of the toes. We call that distal, okay? Close to the midline of the body, we call that medial. Close to the side of the body, we call that lateral, okay? Same with the arm and the legs. Close to the base of the body is proximal. Close to the feet, toes is distal. All right. Close to the front of the body is called anterior or ventral. You may see either one of those, anterior or ventral. Close to the back of the body, it's called posterior or dorsal. Okay. Usually people will refer to behind as posterior. Dorsal, if you think about the, dolphin has a dorsal fin, kind of it's on the back of that animal. All right. Toward the head, we call that cranial. Also call that cephalic. Okay, ceph is a root word for head. All right, toward the toes in a human, or toward essentially the hips or the tail or a foreleg or animal that walks on four legs, we call that caudal. Okay. So also say toward the top of the body, we say superior, and toward the bottom of the body, we say inferior. Okay, but you know that as well. All right, so you can see that there. Toward the head, superior. Toward the lower part of the body, inferior. Okay. Anterior toward the front, and then ventral, posterior or dorsal toward the end of the body, or toward the back side of the body. Again, toward the middle is medial, toward the sides is lateral. Kind of in between structures that are medial and lateral, we call that intermediate. Okay, again, close to the origin of the body part, we call that proximal. And close to the, or farther away from the origin of the body part, of the arm or the leg, we call that distal. If it's toward the surface of the body, we call that superficial. And if it's more inside the body, we call that deep or internal. Okay. So the next thing I want to cover is sectional planes. So you ever seen someone get an X-ray or a CAT scan or CT scan, MRI? They're doing all these sections, right? So you can do sections in essentially 3 or 4 planes. So if you're dividing the body into essentially a front and the back, or anterior and posterior, those are frontal planes. Okay. We divide the body into left and right sides, we call those sagittal planes. If it's down the middle, we call that mid-sagittal. But essentially, any cut that cuts left and right sides is sagittal. And if we cut the body into top and bottom halves, more of a horizontal cut, that's considered transverse. Okay. So what we're going to teach you for this class, frontal, sagittal, and transverse. All right, so I'm going to stand over this stuff. So this plane here is what? Transverse. This plane here is sagittal. This plane here, cutting into, it's frontal, front and back. Okay. Okay, I also want to teach you about body cavities. So for body cavities, what we want you to know here, the brain essentially is inside of the cranial cavity. Right? You say cranial is for the head, right? Does that make sense? Okay, then in your chest, you have a thoracic cavity. And what are the two big organs in your chest? You think about it. In this part of your body, what are your two major organs on the inside? Your lungs and your heart, right? So we're going to divide the thoracic cavity into the pleural cavity, which houses the lungs, and the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. Okay. Now, separating the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is inferior to the thoracic cavity or below it. And so this is abdominal pelvic. We separate that into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. And it should make sense because of the name, abdominal pelvic. Because this is your abdomen, like where your abs are, right? It's where your pelvis is. Okay. Now, your spinal cord is contained inside of what we call the spinal cavity. Okay. And cavities are just spaces, right? So if you get a cavity in your teeth, there's a space developing where there shouldn't be one, but that's a bad cavity. But your body actually has normal cavities. Okay, they're just spaces. All right. So let's see. This cavity, the big one, the big category here, thoracic, composed of the pleural cavity and the pericardial cavity. Right. This big cavity here is the abdominal pelvic cavity, composed of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. So the brain is inside of the cranial cavity. The spinal cord is inside of the. Okay. All right. In the abdominal pelvic cavity, we can divide up that area into quadrants. And yeah, think about it from the perspective of the patient. So your right is the patient's left, and your left is the patient's right. So this is the right upper quadrant, or RUQ. This is the left upper quadrant, or LUQ. This is the left lower quadrant, LLQ, right lower quadrant, RLQ. And it's the side and then up or down. So right upper, left upper. Okay. But just remember it's opposite sides. Okay. We also have body landmarks we want you to know. So we'll start with general categories and then get more specific. So again, the head's cephalic, right? You said ceph means head. This is your upper limb, right? Lower limb. Okay. This is your pubic region, pelvic region, right in here. It's pelvic region, it's the abdominal region, thoracic region, cervical region. Okay. So in the cephalic region, forehead, we call that frontal. Eyes, we call it orbital. It's like a circle in orbit. Nose is nasal. Cheeks are buccal. B-U-C-C-A-L, buccal. Mouth is oral. Okay. Under thoracic, you have the sternal region where your sternum is. And we'll learn about that when we cover the skeletal system. And the axillary region, right here at the armpits. Okay. And the abdominal region, where your belly button is, we call that umbilical, right? That's where the umbilical cord, okay, where that would have gone. So, all right. The pelvic region, okay, so you got the groin, okay, or inguinal region. Okay, pubic is also known as genital, okay. In the upper limb, you have the acromial region. When we get to the skeletal system, you'll know that's actually part of the scapula, okay. Acromial deltoid region here, okay. There's a muscle called the deltoid that attaches around there. Brachial for arm. Antecubital, okay. So this little space here is antecubital. Your wrist is called carpal. Anybody ever heard of carpal tunnel syndrome? Okay, those are the wrists. Fingers are called digits. Okay, this is digital region. In the lower region, the lower limb region, we've got the coxal region or hip. Okay, there's a bone called coxae in the hip. So it's the coxal region. It's called the femoral region for the thigh because there's a femur bone there. Patellar, where your patella is, and your kneecap. Again, in anatomy, we don't say kneecap, we say patella. Crural, for this front part of the leg, we say crural, C-R-U-R-A-L, for that lower leg. Okay. Now, toward the side, we say fibular. That's kind of where the fibula bone is. Okay. The ankles, we call that tarsal. Toes are digital. All right, so that's the anterior or ventral surface body landmarks. Okay, here are the posterior body landmarks. All right, so again, you got upper limb, cephalic, it's your back or your dorsal region. Okay, again, lower limb. So the back of the head, we call it occipital. Okay, again, when we cover skeletal system, you learn about the occipital bone. Okay, and the occipital lobe of the brain back there. Again, here's your acromial region in the shoulder. The upper limb, just like this front space was antecubital, this back space where your elbow is, we call that olecranum. Okay, there's a part of one of your bones in your ulna called the olecranon. Okay, that's why it has that name, fits there. In the back, okay, it's your scapular region because you have a scapula bone right there. Okay, where your vertebrae are, we call that vertebral. Where your sacrum is, we call it sacral. And again, if you don't know about the sacrum, it's okay. We're just starting out, right? Let's read lower back. We call this lumbar region, where the gluteus maximus muscle is, call that gluteal. And the lower leg, just like the front, your kneecap was patellar. The back, we call that popliteal. Just like the front of the leg, we call that crural. Where your calf muscle is, we call it sural. All right, and there's your fibular region again on the side of the leg. Okay. Now, the base of the back of your foot, call it calcaneal. There's a calcaneus bone there. Okay. So those are your posterior body landmarks. Okay. So another thing we want to talk to you about are levels of organization. All right. So I might on a quiz show you, or practical, you might see pictures like this, or you might see, words, and you have to figure out what's the right cellular level that matches. So we'll start kind of work our way from the top down, because I think that we all know that piece. We can see it, right? You can see the organismal level. We're organisms. And human organisms are made up of many organ systems. And so then we move down to the organ system level. Here you can see the cardiovascular system, heart and blood vessels, right? Organ systems are made up of different what? Organs, right? That work together closely. So here we are at the organ level. This organ is the what? Anybody know? It's a heart. And organs are made up of different tissues, okay? Tissues, so we're now moving down to the tissue level. Tissues are made up of different kinds of cells. So now we're down to the cellular level, okay? Cells are made up of molecules, which are made up of atoms, okay? And atoms and molecules are both considered at the chemical level, okay? So, and the atoms combine to form molecules, molecules combine to form cells, okay? So this is sort of an overview of what we're going to talk about in this course, okay? So we're going to transition in the next chapter and lecture from talking about the human body as a whole, to talking about chemistry, then talking about cells and tissues, then talking about organ systems, okay? So it gives you a kind of an overview. So you want to know these different levels. All right, so, all right. So let's kind of review that. So you have, what's the largest level? Organismal level, right? And organisms are made up of what? Before we get to organs, they're made up of what? So between organism and the organ are the organ systems, right? Like cardiovascular system, respiratory system. So organ systems are made up of organs. So that's the organ level. Down from the organismal level to the organ system level to the organ level. Organs are made up of tissues. So we're down to tissue level. Tissues are made up of different cells. So we're down to cellular level. Cells are made up of different molecules. And molecules are made up of atoms. And atoms and molecules are at the what level? Chemical level. Okay. And then one more quick review. So toward the head is considered what? Superior. I accept superior. I also accept cranial or cephalic. Okay. Toward the feet would be what? Inferior. Okay. I'd also accept caudal. Okay. Toward the middle of the body, we call that medial. Toward the sides, we call that lateral, right? Okay. Toward the shoulder would be, first is the fingers. Starts the P. Proximal toward the fingers would be distal. Okay. Same for the legs. So toward my hip would be proximal. Toward my feet would be distal. Okay. Toward the front of my body would be anterior, or starts with a B, ventral. Toward the back of my body would be posterior or dorsal. Okay. All right. Is that starting to kind of make sense a little bit? A little bit. Hopefully, it's at least a little bit. You got to practice. I should have in Canvas some games where you can play and practice this. I highly suggest you do that regularly, because you just got to practice it. Okay. So, so that's kind of what we've got for this week. So what I'd like for you to do now is to go ahead and go back into your Canvas student app, go to discussions. There should be an exit ticket for today. Go ahead and work on that. And we'll pick up with cell anatomy and membrane transport next week.